of the 14th of February, 2004, Valentine's Day. A 17-year-old Aboriginal kid named Thomas Hickey, everyone called him TJ, is riding his bike downhill through the inner Sydney suburb of Waterloo. A police vehicle is nearby. What happened next is, 20 years later, still disputed. What isn't disputed is this. TJ came off his bike and was impaled on a metal fence on Phillip Street, Waterloo, with penetrating injuries to his neck and chest. He was removed from the fence by the officers at the scene, rather than waiting for the ambulance. He was taken to hospital. He died early the next morning, his family beside him. He was 17 years old. Welcome to Truth Be Told, Stories from Black Australia. This podcast is recorded on Wadjuk Noongar country, and we acknowledge the Wadjuk Noongar people as the traditional custodians of the land this show is made on. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present. We extend that respect to all the traditional custodians across the lands from where you are listening from, and to all First Nations peoples listening. Today we're talking about TJ Hickey, the Redfurn riot his death sparked on the night of the 15th of February 2004, and 20 years of his mother standing at that fence every year asking the same question, still unanswered, about why no one has ever been held accountable. Quick note before we keep going. This episode discusses the death of a 17-year-old, evidence of a police cover-up, and 9 hours of civil unrest. Take care of yourself while you listen. If anything in this brings something up for you, 13 Yarn is a crisis line run entirely by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, any hour of the day or night, on 13 92 76. Alright, let's go back to the block, and what it actually was, because this story doesn't make sense without understanding the place it happened in and the community it happened to. The block is a stretch of Waterloo Street in Redfurn, inner Sydney, that became, across the 1970s and 80s, the centre of Sydney's Aboriginal community. It was the first area in the country where Aboriginal people bought and collectively owned their own housing through an Aboriginal cooperative, the Aboriginal Housing Company, founded in 1973. It became a hub for Aboriginal community organisations, health services, legal services, and cultural life, the Aboriginal Medical Service, the Aboriginal Legal Service, and the Murawina Women's Service, all operated in and around the area. It was a place where Aboriginal people from across the country who'd moved to Sydney, many of them families displaced by the stolen generations or by the closure of country missions, could live in a community of their own, without the constant surveillance and judgment of white institutions around them. It was never a wealthy neighbourhood. It sat surrounded by poverty, overcrowding, and the kinds of concentrated disadvantage that are the long, slow legacy of dispossession we've already covered at length on this show. But it was theirs, and that mattered in ways that are difficult to overstate for communities whose entire history had been about having country, family, and belonging taken away. By 2004, the block was also under enormous external pressure. A sustained campaign by New South Wales Police to saturate the area with officers, described by residents and community organisations as targeted harassment of an entire neighbourhood, had been running for years. Aboriginal young people in the neighbourhood described being stopped, questioned, and moved on as a daily, routine experience, the kind of low-level, continuous policing pressure that sits underneath the bigger, more documented incidents and rarely gets counted anywhere but in community memory. TJ Hickey was from Walgett in northwestern New South Wales. He'd come to Sydney to be near family and was living in and around Redfurn. On the morning he died, New South Wales Police had a patrol vehicle known as Redfern 16 in the area searching for a suspect in a violent bag snatch at Redfern railway station earlier that day. TJ also had an outstanding arrest warrant in his name and an internal police profile identifying him as a high-risk suspect, a profile that had been updated just 3 days before his death and was posted in the meal room at Redfern Police Station. All 4 officers directly involved would later deny ever having seen that poster or ever having heard TJ's name before the morning he died. The police account of what happened that morning goes like this. Redfern 16 was driving north on Cope Street when TJ rode across their path and turned into Renwick Street, which runs parallel to Cope. The officers say they then turned into Renwick Street, not to follow TJ, but because that's the direction their patrol was heading. They say they were travelling slowly, at around 15 kilometres an hour. They say TJ hit a raised curb, was flung from his bike, and landed on the fence, and that they were not pursuing him in any meaningful sense. The community's account is different. Multiple witnesses, including TJ's own cousin Roy Hickey, said they saw a police vehicle clip TJ's bike before he came off it. They said the police were chasing him. They said the vehicle was moving faster than any 15 kilometres an hour. At the coronial inquest that followed, when investigators went back over exactly what route the police vehicle had taken that morning, a significant problem emerged. Both officers, Constable Michael Hollingsworth and Constable Nicole Reynolds, had initially failed to mention in their written statements that they'd driven down a pathway between the streets, a pathway that took them directly in the same direction TJ was riding. Reynolds later described this omission as an oversight. She said it was a coincidence that she and her partner had made the same mistake. At the inquest, it also came to light that all 4 officers connected to the incident, the 2 in Redfern 16 and the 2 in a second patrol vehicle, Redfern 17, had gathered at Redfern Police Station after the incident to discuss what they'd include in their statements, with a detective sergeant on hand to advise them on how best to refute any allegation of a pursuit before each typing up their accounts simultaneously in the same room. The coroner, who eventually handed down his findings in September of 2004, ruled that TJ's death was a freak accident. He accepted that Redfern 16 had been following TJ, but concluded that following was not the same as pursuing. He declined to make adverse findings against the officers. A critical reason the inquest couldn't fully resolve what had happened was that Constable Hollingsworth, the driver, exercised his right as a citizen to refuse to give evidence entirely. The NSW Police Commissioner at the time, Ken Moroney, publicly backed that decision, making a point in an ABC radio interview about the distinction between being followed and being pursued, while defending his officer's choice not to say anything under oath. It was an investigation into a teenager's death in which the driver of the vehicle most directly connected to that death never had to explain what he'd done to a court. The political responses that followed TJ's death sat alongside this coronial process in ways that made the community's experience even harder to bear. Premier Bob Carr announced within days that the government stood 100% behind its police in Redfern. Prime Minister John Howard said he thought the allegations against police were unreasonable and that he very much defended the police position. Both statements came before any inquest had concluded from the two most senior elected officials in the country, publicly endorsing the police account, while TJ's family was still in the immediate shock of losing him. For a community already conditioned by decades of experience to know that official endorsements of police over Aboriginal people would follow any incident like this, the speed and totality of those endorsements removed any remaining doubt about what the inquest was likely to conclude. On the evening of the 15th of February, the night after TJ died, people gathered on Waterloo Street. The crowd included Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal residents from the block and nearby areas, young people and older community members, people who'd grown up on that street, people who'd known TJ personally, and people who simply recognized what his death represented in a neighbourhood that had been living under intense police pressure for years. As the night went on, around 200 police were deployed to the area. 9 hours of confrontation followed, running from early evening well past midnight. Redfurn railway station was set on fire. A police hut on the block itself was burned. Bricks, bottles, and petrol bombs were thrown. More than 40 officers were injured, though no members of the community died. It was the most significant urban confrontation between police and an Aboriginal community in Australia in decades, broadcast live on television into homes across the country that had largely no idea what daily life in Redfern actually looked like, and it happened because a community that had been telling anyone who would listen about the pressure it was living under had just watched a 17-year-old kid die in a way nobody in power was willing to properly account for. In the weeks and years that followed, the response from government focused almost entirely on the riot, rather than on the death that caused it. The block faced increased policing, fresh plans to restructure the housing cooperative, and sustained political pressure to dismantle what remained of the community's independent infrastructure. Investigations into the riot resulted in several prosecutions of community members. Investigations into TJ's death resulted in no charges, no further inquiry, and no public accounting for the statement coordination that had taken place at Redfern Police Station the morning he died. His mother, Gail Hickey, has come back to the fence on Phillip Street every year since. She's marched through Redfern every February, calling for the inquest to be reopened. In 2024, on the 20th anniversary of TJ's death, she told a journalist that she never would have thought she'd have to stand there and fight for her son for 20 years. She said it was heartbreaking to come back every year to march. There have been some specific, pointed attempts to ensure TJ's death stays in public memory beyond the annual march. In 2005, students from the University of Technology, Sydney, donated a plaque bearing TJ's portrait to be placed on the wall near the fence. The inscription described him as impaled upon the metal fence arising from a police pursuit and said that in our hearts you will stay, TJ, New South Wales Police, the state government and the Department of Housing all refused to allow the plaque to be placed there unless the words police pursuit were changed to tragic accident. The family refused to change the wording. The plaque was never installed. In 2020, the Hickey family's lawyers appealed to the United Nations Human Rights Committee, asking them to examine whether TJ's death involved racial discrimination and whether the coronial inquest had been adequate. The committee's eventual finding was that the death was an accident, a result the family rejected. In 2024, advocates renewed calls to rename the Redfurn Community Centre after TJ, a small recognition within a community that still carries his name. So that's where we'll leave it for this one. A 17-year-old riding his bike on a February morning, dead by the next day, with a dispute about what happened between those two events that has never been fully resolved. 4 officers who wrote their statements simultaneously in the same room after being advised by a detective sergeant on how best to handle the allegation of a pursuit. A driver who exercised his right to say nothing at all, backed publicly by his police commissioner before any inquest had even started. A family that was told it was a freak accident and asked to replace the word pursuit with accident on the memorial plaque they donated. And a mother who has come back to the same fence on the same street every year for 20 years, still waiting for the answer her son deserves. The phrase freak accident is worth sitting with for a moment. TJ Hickey had an active internal police profile identifying him as high risk, updated 3 days before his death, displayed in the mealroom of the station whose officers were in that area that morning. The vehicle whose driver says he had no idea who TJ was, then turned in the same direction TJ was riding, drove down a pathway that didn't appear in either officer's initial statement, and reached the scene within moments of TJ hitting that fence. The coroner found that none of this added up to a pursuit. A great many people in Redfern, and well beyond it, found that conclusion impossible to accept. 20 years on, with the inquest still closed and no new evidence examined, nothing has changed that picture. If something in this one is sitting with you, let it sit for a minute before you reach for the next distraction. That discomfort is doing something useful. Thanks for listening to Truth Be Told. This has been a Three Brothers production. I'll see you next time.